In December of 2012, moviegoing audiences and Tolkien fans the world over were brought back to Peter Jackson's rendition of Middle-earth, with his adaptation of Tolkien's original fantasy novel, The Hobbit. It has been 10 years since the first of the Hobbit movies was released, and as such, I wanted to do a video commemorating that anniversary. Hello everybody, I am the Linkzilla, and today we're going to be talking about the Hobbit Trilogy. It blows my mind to consider that the first entry in the trilogy is going to be 10 years old this month, as I have memories about the lead up to them so fresh in my mind, and even still, the films still have that recent feel to them. Talks of Peter Jackson adapting The Hobbit had been making the rounds almost as far back as when the original trilogy ended, and then, a little over 10 years after the Lord of the Rings trilogy was concluded, fans were surprised to hear that the Hobbit adaptation had been officially announced. But that was only the first of many surprises, as news quickly followed that the adaptation for The Hobbit would actually be split into 2 movies. That's right, folks. Most people forget that this trilogy was originally planned as a duology, before eventually deciding that it would be best to split the story into a trilogy instead. What surprises me to this very day is the apprehension towards this idea, and even worse, the negative backlash The Hobbit receives from critics and fans alike. Granted, I can understand some of it. This did come at a time where it seemed like Warner Bros. Wanted to split every major novel adaptation into 2 parts to make more money, but I'm here to make the argument that that is not what had happened in the Hobbit trilogy. It's actually kind of bothered me over the years that people dismiss these films for, quote, bloating a short children's story. And yes, The Hobbit is only about 300 pages long, comparatively making it the shortest of Tolkien's Middle-earth books, and most people conflate this decision with the assumption that the movie studio made up a whole bunch of crap to shove into the movie to increase the runtime. To those people, I say, have you ever actually read the book? The simple fact is, when you're adapting a story to the screen, you gotta determine how much of it will fit into a typical runtime for a movie, and The Hobbit, despite being deceptively short, is actually a very long and eventful story. There was probably enough material in the book to make a mini-series covering the events. Had the production tried to cram everything into one movie, the movie itself would feel ridiculously fast-paced. Moving from one location to the next at breakneck speeds, we would probably get no time for character development, and the audience would feel the film was bloated and exhausting anyway. By breaking it up into a trilogy, the production team managed to circumvent this problem by adapting the books while also providing breathing room to better develop the characters and their motivations. Plus, it gives the opportunity to actually utilize the iconic imagery of the series established by the Lord of the Rings trilogy. When you take everything into consideration, the movies actually fairly accurately depict their prospective portions of the book with hardly anything extra added to it. Then again, that's not to say that they didn't add some things to the story, but when you get down to it, the things they supposedly added are all things that Tolkien would later establish were in fact happening at the same time anyway. So, I've decided to undertake the task of going through the Hobbit trilogy and comparing the movies to the novel that they're based on. The first film covers about the first 7 chapters of The Hobbit, and I would say is probably the closest in terms of adaptation. So, let's take a look at The Hobbit, An Unexpected Journey, and see how they did. To start off with, the movie begins with an opening narration told by the elderly Bilbo Baggins, played by the late Sir Ian Holm, recanting his adventures in the book that he is writing to leave to his nephew Frodo. Admittedly, this doesn't happen in the book, but its inclusion here is welcome and logical. You see, while Tolkien originally wrote and intended The Hobbit to have a third-person narrator, in The Fellowship of the Ring, he actually retconned it to reveal that the Hobbit book we know is Bilbo's memoir, There and Back Again, A Hobbit's Tale, and this is coupled with Gandalf revealing that Bilbo lied about some of the details. So the movie having this scene ties that plot point into the story, as Bilbo is writing the very same book before our very eyes. Plus, like I said, this is an example of the series taking advantage of the iconic imagery established by the Lord of the Rings trilogy. Seeing Ian Holm as he narrates, writing his book, the very same book we see him writing when we meet him in Fellowship of the Ring, it gives the audience a very welcoming feeling. Bilbo's narration goes on to explain the backstory of Erebor and Dale. We see the kingdom in its heyday, and are even introduced to some of our principal characters, mainly being Thror, Thorin, and Thranduil, and actually establish the Arkenstone and its importance to the story. We also bear witness to the devastation of Smaug's attack. This flashback scene isn't in the book, nor does it start out the novel. Instead, all the details of the events that motivate the quest are given in explanation to Bilbo, and subsequently to the reader, from Thorin and the dwarves. Other details being that Thorin and Balin are clearly present for the battle against Smaug inside of the mountain, while the book explains that they were just fortunate enough to have been out on an adventure that day, and it's by that luck that they survived the slaughter. The movie also shows Thorin dragging Thror out of his treasure hoard and even helping his father to safety out the front gate. This is different from the novel that details that both Thror and Thrain used the secret passage to escape from Smaug after being trapped in the mountain, the very same passage that the company of Thorin will use in their quest. Other details changed from the book involve the source of the dwarves' feud with the elves. In the book, the feud is simply nothing more than the elves making fun of the dwarves for their beards and bellies, and the dwarves likewise thinking elves to be silly folk. The film instead shows that after having witnessed the devastation left by the dragon, Thranduil refused to lead his company to aid them and turned away the dwarves' plight and need. The movie shows Bilbo begin writing what is the actual beginning of the book, going into a detailed description of the Hobbit hole. While the dialogue is lifted straight from the book, the scene also features Elijah Wood reprising his role as Frodo. The scene plays out with some banter between the two hobbits as Bilbo realizes that his 111th birthday celebration is today and the guests will be arriving. This leads to a comical scene of him preparing himself for his untrustworthy cousins, the Sackville Bagginses, alluding back to the feud he's had with them for years. This all culminates with Bilbo asking Frodo to hang a sign on the front gate before he goes to wait for and meet with Gandalf. While obviously not happening in the book just instead goes into great detail listing off what hobbits are, their personal habits, and explaining a little of Bilbo's ancestry and backstory. This is the film once again paying homage to its legacy by using the iconic imagery. Seeing Elijah back as Frodo is always a plus. The feud between Lobelia and Bilbo is as funny as ever, and we see the iconic no admittance sign being put on the fence. All of this culminates with the realization that these events are literally taking place at the beginning of the Fellowship of the Ring. The film then cuts to 60 years earlier, where we see probably the biggest change made to the overall story: the characters, particularly the characters of Bilbo and Gandalf. The scene largely plays out like an abridged version of how it went down in the book, with only subtle changes. For the one thing, the circumstances of Gandalf stopping there. The book implies that Gandalf was simply passing through, to our knowledge at least, and it isn't until Bilbo bids him a friendly good morning as he passes that Gandalf decides to stay and chat. In the film, however, it's clear that Gandalf is stopping here for a reason. The depictions of Bilbo and Gandalf are largely different than their book counterparts. Bilbo, portrayed here by Martin Freeman, is portrayed as a bit more awkward and the slightest bit impatient in awkward situations, and is immediately flummoxed when he sees Gandalf standing there. This is in contrast to his book counterpart, where he was largely cheerily enjoying his morning and came off as more happy-go-lucky and willfully beckoned Gandalf as he passed by, even inviting Gandalf to smoke a pipe with him. Gandalf, on the other hand, played once again by the great Sir Ian McKellen, is portrayed much more lighter and friendlier than his book counterpart. Gandalf in the novel can come off as far more overbearing, stern, and easily offended, and even rude at times, whereas in the film, it's clear that Gandalf is portrayed with a more playful nature. He speaks to Bilbo in much friendlier terms, trying to break the awkwardness of the situation with some light-hearted humor, and gives a more genuine effort to entice Bilbo to join his adventure. Another change is Bilbo taking a more proactive measure to try and leave the conversation and set Gandalf on his way. Much like in the book, he claims no one around would be interested in adventuring and begins reading the letters from his mailbox. However, instead of simply sitting awkwardly, realizing that Gandalf isn't leaving, the film has Bilbo move back towards his front door. Gandalf, of course, chastises Bilbo for not knowing him. However, much like I said, when Gandalf shows offense and even genuine hurt at not being remembered, he makes the effort to calm down and collect himself. In the book, Gandalf seems to have taken a greater offense to it being forgotten. The book has Gandalf flat out state that he intends to send Bilbo on this adventure, whereas in the film it is largely just implied. The biggest change is perhaps how Bilbo handles the situation from book to film. In the book, Bilbo is largely more timid and rarely stands up for himself, so instead of giving a flat-out refusal to Gandalf, he instead invites Gandalf to tea at his house the next day. In the movie, Bilbo, wanting to immediately shut down any notion of adventures, blatantly refuses and tells Gandalf to find someone else before retreating into his house. As I said, the biggest change so far is Bilbo not inviting Gandalf to tea the next day, and yet in both the film and the book, Bilbo wasn't expecting any guests at all, mainly due to Bilbo having forgotten that he'd invited him until he hears a ring at the door. The film changes the following events, whereas in the book they happen in the afternoon the following day, they instead begin on that same night. Much like in the book, the dwarves begin to arrive, initially without Gandalf, starting with Dwalin. The changes made from the books in regards to the dwarves are largely cosmetic ones. The book describes the dwarves' wardrobe as being distinctly more colorful, and that's actually the best we end up getting, considering that apart from their names, the only thing used to identify the dwarves are age and hood color. This change was largely done to fit with the aesthetic of the Jackson Lord of the Rings trilogy, and was ultimately the correct decision, as such a colorful array of characters wouldn't fit in this version of the story, so instead, each of the dwarves are given distinctive looks that reflect their overall personalities showcased for the film. The dwarves arrive in the same order set by the novel, with the exception of the last two groups of dwarves being combined into one, with 8 dwarves falling in as a pile into Bag End instead of just 4, also Thorin not being among them in the movie. The biggest change is Bilbo's attitude towards this in the film. While keeping a fair amount of patience, Bilbo becomes more assertive as more guests arrive, from trying to ask them to leave, telling them that they've come to the wrong place and shutting the door on them, and even ranting and yelling before opening the door to them. This is a sharp contrast to how Bilbo is in the books. Because Bilbo is so timid and wanting to be a polite host, he immediately begins accepting each of his guests as they arrive, and even begins waiting on them, taking orders of what they'd like for the afternoon tea. In the film, he's having none of it, as he tries, unsuccessfully, to stop the dwarves from raiding his pantry. The unexpected party concludes with Bilbo's stores of food being completely emptied, and Bilbo being incredibly frustrated with Gandalf. In the book, Bilbo goes to try and clean up all the used dishes himself before the dwarves take up themselves, with Bilbo saying that they needn't bother trying to do his duty as host. In the movie, Bilbo is more concerned about whether or not the dwarves will break the dishes with their rough and reckless treatment. And, much like in the book, they include the Blunt the Knives song in the film. This is another addition that I will go over later, but the gist of it is, this is an improvised song that the dwarves sing, detailing a bunch of terrible things to do to annoy Bilbo as they clean his dishes and make up his kitchen. The song ends, much like in the book, with Bilbo being astonished at all the dishes cleaned and collected in a neat pile. What follows is largely just a bridging or rearranging of the order of events, so I'll try to get through it as quickly as possible. Thorin arrives at the door after the song. In the novel, Thorin had already arrived, being a part of the last group that fell through the door, Thorin himself being at the bottom of the pile. Separating Thorin like this not only allows Thorin to keep his dignity, but also separate him from the rest of the group, highlighting his importance. Note, the book has to keep reminding you that Thorin is important. Thorin mentions being late as only finding the house due to the magic mark that Gandalf put out. The book states that Gandalf stamped out the mark on the door with his staff upon arriving at Bag End. Thorin immediately begins assessing Bilbo as a potential burglar, comparing him more to a grocer rather than a burglar. In this book, this line of dialogue is given to Gloin. The meeting in regards to the quest is heavily abridged in the film from the book. In the book, after the afternoon tea, the story meanders, with Gandalf and Thorin playing a game of magic smoke rings, and the dwarves playing music on their instruments. They play until all hours of the night and only get around to explaining themselves, the quest, as well as Bilbo's role in it much later in the evening. It's actually here that we get the backstory explaining the situation in Erebor with the dragon. With the prologue having established it, the movie saves time without having to explain everything again for Bilbo's sake. Gandalf reveals the map and key just as he does in the book. However, the circumstances of how he came by them is changed. In the movie, he says that they were given to him by Thorin's father Thrain before he went missing. As for the novel, well, I'll have to explain that detail when we get to the Desolation of Smaug. Thorin expresses concern that others may try to claim Erebor and the treasure within if they do not act soon. This dialogue does not happen in the book, but the novel showcases the very real possibility of that very thing happening. Ori states the need for a burglar in the movie after Gandalf explains his plan. In the novel, Gandalf is the one to announce why burglary is needed. Gandalf originally tried looking for a hero to potentially slay a dragon, only to find that most heroes are either too busy or retired, so he settled on burglary instead. In the novel, Bilbo asks the dwarves what he's going to get out of going on the quest and asks for terms, the risks, time required, out-of-pocket expenses, etc. This leads into the explanation of the quest, and by the next morning, the dwarves have written up a 2-paragraph contract in addition to the note left for Bilbo detailing just that. In the movie, the contract is a lengthy document that was already prepared. The lines involving all of Bilbo's terms from the novel are instead given over to Balin. Reading the contract causes Bilbo to faint, and the dwarves put him aside in a chair with a drink. In the novel, this happens much earlier in the night before Bilbo began asking about the quest. In the novel, when Bilbo recovers, he recalls stories of his great-uncle Bullroarer having slain the Goblin King in the Battle of Greenfields, as well as inventing the game of golf. This inspires Bilbo, and he even boasts of it to the dwarves. In the movie, this story is instead given to Gandalf as he tries to inspire Bilbo to join the quest. On that note, Gandalf expresses concern for Bilbo's sedentary life and petty worries, and reminds him of his youth when he was an adventurous and far more tookish hobbit. He tries to inspire Bilbo to rekindle such feelings and join the quest, sounding genuinely for Bilbo's own good. The novel has no such conversation, as Gandalf, as you'll see, seems largely indifferent to the overall quest. In the movie, Bilbo flat out refuses to sign the contract and go along with the quest, and instead goes off to his room, ending the meeting. In the novel, Bilbo inadvertently commits to going along with the quest several times, though you'll see he has no real choice in the matter regardless. Bilbo announces that they should retire for the night and get a good night's sleep, and even promises to make breakfast for the dwarves, which he later reneges on due to their rude behavior. The movie concludes the night with Thorin leading the dwarves in the Song of the Misty Mountain, a shorter version than in the actual novel. The song was featured earlier in the book after the luncheon and the smoke ring game. However, it is somewhat fitting as, when all the dwarves go to bed, Bilbo can hear Thorin humming lyrics of the song to himself before he falls asleep, thereby ending both nights in the novel and the film. In the novel, it's explained that Bilbo had to prepare his spare rooms for the dwarves to sleep in, even making makeshift beds out of chairs for them. In the movie, there is no evidence to the dwarves having stayed the night, and is likely that they returned to the Green Dragon Inn. In both versions, Bilbo awakens to find the dwarves gone and thinking that he's narrowly avoided going on the adventure. Both versions showcase a mix of feelings on this revelation. The next few changes are very crucial to the overall film adaptations. Choice. When Bilbo wakes the next morning, the novel shows that all the dishes in the kitchen are used again from the dwarves' breakfast. Bilbo spends his morning cleaning up after the dwarves and makes himself 2 helpings of breakfast before Gandalf arrives. Gandalf explains that the dwarves left a message for him to meet them at the Green Dragon Inn before they set off at 11 o'clock, and hurries Bilbo out the door with no supplies or luggage. Gandalf himself stays behind to pack a traveler's bag with some supplies for Bilbo. The movie changes these events as Gandalf does not hurry Bilbo out the door, instead showcasing that Bilbo has a second thought about the adventure while looking at the contract. The next scene shows Bilbo fully dressed with a bag of supplies racing across the Shire, trying to meet the dwarves before they set off. Bilbo catches them as they are setting out on their ponies and hands over the contract to Balin. I'll largely save my opinions for another video, but this to me is one of the more powerful changes to the story. In the novel, you get a sense that Bilbo is largely bullied into going along with the quest, which comes off as incredibly unfair given how dangerous it ends up being. But here, you see that it's Bilbo's latent Tookish nature that wins through, and even though he was free and clear to go about with his life, he makes the choice to join the quest. He chooses to go with them, which I believe is better for Bilbo's character arc.
I'm going on an adventure!
The book mentions how Bilbo is without his pocket handkerchief and left without his hat. Dwalin tells him that he'll have to do without the handkerchief, but offers him a spare green hood he has with him. In the movie, since Bilbo has already arrived fully dressed and supplied, and since the dwarves don't wear hoods, this exchange isn't had, and the line about doing without handkerchiefs is given to Gandalf. The film adds an amusing bit where the dwarves take wagers with each other, Gandalf included, on whether or not Bilbo would turn up. Such an exchange is not present in the novel, as the dwarves expected Bilbo to come anyway. This next part of the story makes a lot of changes. The novel describes their quest as they move further away from civilized areas and further into the wilds, Bilbo even seeing old abandoned castles made by wicked people. The film just gives us sweeping shots of the New Zealand countryside, which is always welcome. The movie includes some extra scenes. An orc screech is heard while the group makes camp on a cliff. This leads into Balin explaining why Thorin hates orcs so much. A detailed flashback to the Battle of Azanulbizar, in which Thror is killed, Thrain disappears, and Thorin confronts his nemesis, Azog the Defiler. Many details are changed. For the one thing, The Hobbit describes that this battle was against goblins and not orcs, though Tolkien would later admit that they are largely interchangeable. Azog is only ever mentioned once in the entire novel, accredited with Thror's death, and is killed by Thorin's cousin, Dane Ironfoot, in the battle. The film changes it to include Azog throughout the rest of the trilogy. Though Thorin wounded Azog, cutting off his right hand, Azog would survive and would continue to menace the dwarves all throughout the movies. This makes Azog the villain of the story and gives the audience a face to identify, while also giving Thorin a more of a personal antagonist that he has to overcome. These events aren't detailed in the Hobbit book, but are instead brought up in other supplementary Tolkien works. Thror was actually killed before the battle began, and was actually the reason the battle started. Believing that Moria was unguarded, Thror entered the city himself, expecting it to be empty. His severed head was sent rolling out of the front gate for his troubles, Azog having cut it off himself and written his name on Thror's forehead, announcing who rules Khazad-dûm. Also not mentioned in either the novel or the movie is that Thorin's brother, Frerin, was also present at the battle and killed. So Thorin lost a grandfather, a father, as well as a brother that day. The scene ends with the revelation that Finnbull, a warg-riding orc hunter, is stalking the group, and has his underlings send word to their master at having found them, alluding to Azog's survival in the story. Such an exchange and character did not exist in the novel. The novel does describe a scene where the dwarves are caught in heavy rain, drenched and miserable, and even lose some of their supplies that get swept into a river. In the movie, the dwarves are simply irritated by the rain, and Dori asks Gandalf to do something about it, only for Gandalf to refuse. This leads into a conversation about the other Istari and the roles they play in Middle-earth. Such an exchange does not happen in the novel. The movie has Gandalf mention Radagast the Brown and leads into a lengthy scene which introduces Radagast on the southern borders of Mirkwood as he investigates a sickness falling on the forest. His investigation leads him to tracking giant spiders and trails them back to Dol Guldur before the scene ends. Such a scene doesn't happen in the books, as Radagast is only casually mentioned as being a cousin of Gandalf's when they meet with Beorn. Radagast did have a minor role to play in The Lord of the Rings, but was cut from the film for time, so fitting him in the story here, plus the logical explanation for it, was a nice addition. Plus, it also sets the stage for things to come on the company's journey. The company stopped to make camp at a ruined farmhouse with Gandalf and Thorin arguing. It's at this point that Gandalf storms off in a huff, having become frustrated by Thorin's stubbornness. This provides a better and plausible explanation for why Gandalf is not present, as in the novel, Gandalf just disappears at random times. He literally wanders off without anyone noticing until he's been gone for a while. This was ultimately done by Tolkien to help add tension, as without Gandalf, it leaves Bilbo and the dwarves vulnerable to attack. This section of the film adapts the second chapter, Roast Mutton, but changes a lot of small details. In the novel, the group is low on supplies. They are tired, cold, and hungry when they notice a light in the distance. They send Bilbo to investigate in the hopes that it's someone who will share their supplies with them, but are cautious of any danger. They instruct Bilbo to hoot twice like a barn owl and once like a screech owl if he gets into trouble and needs help. In the movie, the circumstances change as, while the dwarves are having dinner, Fili and Kili realize that two of their ponies are gone, spot the light in the distance, and send Bilbo to rescue the ponies, telling him to hoot twice like a barn owl and once like a brown owl if in trouble. In the movie, one of the trolls, William, has taken a total of 4 ponies back to their camp with the intent to eat them. Meanwhile, Bert is currently making a stew while Tom sits and complains. In the novel, the 3 trolls are having roasted mutton for dinner, hence the title of the chapter, though the movie does include Bert's line from the book complaining about having nothing but mutton to eat for the last few days.
Mutton yesterday, mutton today, and blind, if it don't look like mutton again tomorrow.
In the movie, Bilbo sneaks about the trolls' camp and tries to steal a large knife from Tom to set the ponies free. In the novel, Bilbo stays and attempts some burglary to prove himself to the dwarves. He decides to steal a large purse from William's pocket, only for the purse to magically start talking, alerting William and getting Bilbo caught. This is changed in the movie as it would have contrasted with the tone. Instead, Bilbo is accidentally grabbed up in Tom's handkerchief when the troll used it to blow his nose. In the movie, William questions whether or not they can cook Bilbo, with Tom suggesting they can try. In the novel, Tom poses the question, with Bert suggesting they try. William was largely more interested in why Bilbo was picking his pocket. The movie leaves out much of dialogue from Bilbo, including him almost revealing the dwarves, saying lots and none at all, which confuses and intrigues Bert, while also trying to talk his way out of getting eaten, even offering to cook a nice meal for the trolls in return. The novel mentions that William was full from dinner and slightly tipsy on beer, and suggests letting Bilbo go, deeming him not worth the effort. But Bert holds on to Bilbo, wanting to unravel his confusing words about lots and none at all. The movie doesn't include this exchange. The book mentions that the trolls have a brief fight with each other, dropping Bilbo. Unfortunately, the Hobbit is so winded from being held tightly that he has no energy to escape, but he does get out of the way of their fight. Such a scene does not happen in the movie. In the book, the dwarves come in one by one, starting with Balin to investigate what happened to Bilbo. This breaks up the trolls' fight as the trolls work together to capture the dwarves in sacks. Thorin is the last to arrive and even attempts to fight off the trolls with Bilbo's help, only for him to be captured as well as Bilbo stuck in a bush. In the movie, however, Keeley comes in to rescue Bilbo before all of the dwarves charge in, leading to a battle scene. Though the dwarves fight competently, it's clear that they're simply outmatched. Bilbo seizes the opportunity to free the horses, only for William and Bert to capture him, threatening to rip him apart if the dwarves don't surrender. Reluctantly, the dwarves comply. The movie shows some dwarves as well as Bilbo tied up in sacks, while the rest of the dwarves are tied up to a roasting spit over the fire. In the novel, Bilbo is still in hiding while the dwarves are all in sacks. The movie also shows the sacks having tied to keep the company's heads exposed, whereas in the book, the sacks are pulled down over their heads and tied at their feet. The movie has the trolls debate on how to cook the dwarves, much like in the novel. However, in the film, William lets it slip that dawn is coming soon and reveals that they'll turn to stone if not careful. It is here that Bilbo begins talking to the trolls, trying to stall for time, Bilbo noticing Gandalf lurking around in the backgrounds of the camp. The novel has Gandalf instead sneaking around the camp, impersonating the trolls' voices in order to stir up disagreements and get the trolls arguing and fighting with each other. Gandalf only reveals himself right before the dawn creeps up and turns them all to stone. In the movie, Bilbo's stalling gives Gandalf enough time to get into position and split a boulder overhanging their camp, exposing them to the dawning light. In the film, Thorin and Gandalf discuss how long it had been since the trolls had been that way, with Gandalf mentioning a time when a dark power ruled the lands. Much like in the novel, Gandalf deduced that there is a cave nearby where the trolls would hide during the daylight. The movie, however, shows the troll horde as just a normal open cave, whereas in the novel, it's actually blocked by a large stone door and requires a key to open, a key that Bilbo found fallen from William's pocket during the initial scuffle. Both in the movie and film, Gandalf and Thorin find swords, Glamdring and Orcrist in the trolls' horde. However, it is only in the movie that Gandalf recognizes them as elvish blades of Gondolin. In the novel, they are drawn to them by their jeweled scabbards. In the film, Thorin's dislike of elves is more pronounced as Thorin goes to leave the sword, hearing of its elvish make, before Gandalf convinces him otherwise. The novel also describes that Bilbo takes what he assumed was a small knife in a leather scabbard to use as a weapon. The movie features Gandalf finding the small elvish blade buried under some leaves and gives it to Bilbo, explaining its elvish properties. He also tells Bilbo that
true courage is about knowing not when to take a life, but when to spare one.
The movie deviates from the book as the group prepare for something coming quickly towards them. Enter Radagast, having been looking for Gandalf. Ironically given a line of dialogue originally belonging to Smaug much later in the story. Radagast explains what is happening to the Greenwood and the spiders that have taken over it. The movie cuts to a flashback of Radagast investigating the fortress of Dol Guldur, where he encounters the spirit of the Witch King of Angmar. He successfully parries the Morgul blade from the ghost before the necromancer arrives. Radagast is scared off, chased out of the forest by a flock of large bats. He then passes the Morgul blade to Gandalf wrapped in bandages. None of this happens in the novel. In the book, Gandalf explains his disappearance was that he was meeting with some elf friends along the road and sent them ahead to prepare lodgings for them in Rivendell. The elves also warned Gandalf that trolls had been spotted nearby, so he immediately returns to the group to help. The movie brushes off this explanation, and Gandalf's motives are kept secret, for now. The group is attacked by a pair of warg scouts and realize that an orc pack is coming. Gandalf realizes that the group is being hunted. Unfortunately, they can't escape as the ponies all scattered due to the battle with the trolls, the last we see of the ponies in the movies, whereas in the novels they manage to keep the horses until the Misty Mountains, where they are taken by the goblins much later. Radagast offers to distract the orc pack and lead them off to give Gandalf and his group a chance to escape. The orcs chase Radagast on his sled, pulled by Hroskabel rabbits, while Gandalf tries to lead the company away. However, it's clear from the scene that Radagast and Gandalf are coordinating the path to herd the company in a specific direction. The dwarves accidentally alert the orcs to their location as Fimbul gives chase. The dwarves stand their ground to fight before Gandalf reveals a secret passage between some rocks, beckoning them down into it for safety. The dwarves are saved when a hunting party of elves comes by and drives off the orcs. The company then follows the tunnel. The tunnel leads them to Rivendell, much to Thorin and the other dwarves' irritation and hesitation, believing that the elves to be their enemies. Gandalf reveals that this was his intention and why he left the group earlier, claiming that Elrond could possibly read the runes on the map and discern the secret door's location. This plays out differently in the novel, as Gandalf revealed his plans to take them to Rivendell earlier and that it would take a few days for them to reach it. First and foremost, there's no orc pack chasing them. The film added that in for a suspenseful moment. The novel covers them spending the next several days traveling through the valleys, trying to find Rivendell. Upon arriving in the valley, the elves initially tease the company, while a chorus of elves sing a welcoming song, "Oh, where are you going?" as they enter. The song is not present in the movie, and the group is instead greeted by Lindir, Elrond's butler, before Elrond's hunting party, the same from earlier, arrives. The movie shows a greater hostility from the dwarves towards the elves, while Elrond greets Thorin with kindness and respect, claiming that he knew Thror during his time as King of Erebor. And although Thorin initially insults Elrond, he still offers food and lodgings to the company. This, of course, did not happen in the book, as the feud between elves and dwarves is much less personal. The book heavily abridges their time in Rivendell, explaining that they spend about 2 weeks there, resting and resupplying. This is not the case in the movie, as even in the extended edition, it implies that the group is there for maybe 1 or 2 days. The movie shows Elrond identifying Orcrist and Glamdring during the dinner scene shortly after their arrival. This happens relatively late in their stay in Rivendell. In the book, Thorin claims to take the sword in honor and graciously accepts it. In the film, Thorin is more reserved and merely gives a polite nod to Elrond. The movie cuts to nighttime, where Gandalf convinces a reluctant Thorin and Balin to show the map to Elrond so that he may decipher it. Elrond deduces that there are moon runes written there, a bit of a plot convenience given the film's much shorter stay in Rivendell, but Elrond even comments about what good fortune it is that the correct shape and season of moon is in the sky that very night that they arrived. Elrond reads the runes, revealing the instructions to open the door. All of this happens much later in their stay in Rivendell, shortly before the group departs to continue their journey. Another small change is that in the film, Bilbo asks what Durin's Day is, and Gandalf gives the explanation. In the novel, Elrond asks what Durin's Day is, and Thorin gives the explanation. The movie cuts to Weathertop, where Fingal explains the dwarves' escape to Azog, revealing the Pale Orc to be alive. Azog kills Fingal before tossing his body to the wargs, announcing to his minions to spread the word, placing a bounty on the dwarves' heads. Obviously, this did not happen in the novel. The extended edition features a scene of Bilbo wandering through Elrond's house, taking in the scenery, and even coming across the shards of Narsil and the painting of the Siege of Bagorlad. It is here that Bilbo spots a depiction of the ring on Sauron's hand, but nothing truly comes of it. The scene also features a moment between Elrond and Bilbo where the Elf Lord offers to let Bilbo stay in Rivendell if he wishes. This scene might be considered just a bit of fan service, but like I've said before, it's showcasing the legacy of the Lord of the Rings trilogy by showing us the iconic imagery. It's giving us context that this is the same world that we knew. It also establishes the one moment on Bilbo's journey where he felt the most comfortable and quite taken by the valley, detailing why he would want to go back after his 111th birthday. This scene also ends on an amusing bit where the dwarves can be seen roughhousing in the local fountain. None of this happens in the book. A running theme in the movie is keeping the quest to Erebor a secret. The company fears that if news got out, powerful parties will attempt to stop them. It makes sense considering that Smaug is a very powerful dragon and is considered to be an ill-tempered and vengeful creature. So far, he's gone quiet for some time and things have remained peaceful. But if Smaug should be awakened and angered by the dwarves, then he could easily retaliate on the neighboring lands, something that comes to fruition in the books and films. Elrond is among those who would stop them in the film only. In the novel, he's happy to help the dwarves on their quest and bids that they farewell when he sees them off. The movie continues the necromancer subplot, including a scene of the White Council, where Elrond has summoned Saruman and Galadriel to try and stop the dwarf company. Gandalf reveals his intentions for this quest, as he's trying to prevent Smaug from forming an alliance to Sauron, whom the others believe to be dead. Gandalf reveals the Morgul blade given to him by Radagast, much to Elrond and Galadriel's alarm. They detail that Angmar and all of his possessions are sealed in the tombs of Rudar, and that they cannot be opened. Saruman ignores this and says this is merely a coincidence, and reveals his intent to stop the company of Thorin from going any further. The scene ends with Galadriel reading Gandalf's mind, revealing that Gandalf had merely been stalling the council while the dwarves sneak out and go on their way. None of this happens in the book, as I already detailed that after staying 2 weeks in Rivendell, the dwarves go on their way with a blessing and supplying from Elrond, Gandalf even being given a new white horse better suited to ride the paths of the Misty Mountains. The horse is not mentioned in the film, as by this point the entire group has lost their horses. The movie includes a scene with Gandalf and Galadriel as they discuss the plans of the necromancer. Galadriel even asks Gandalf why he chose Bilbo Baggins, in probably one of the most beautifully blocked, directed, and acted scenes in the movie.
I found it is the small things, everyday deeds of ordinary folk, that keeps the darkness at bay. Simple acts of kindness and love. Why Bilbo Baggins? Perhaps it is because I'm afraid, and it gives me courage.
This greatly contrasts with Gandalf's motivation in the novel, not specifically stated in The Hobbit, but more from Tolkien's other works. When Gandalf decided he needed a burglar and thought a hobbit would make a good choice, he approached finding a candidate like mixing a scientific formula. He wanted someone who was adventurous and courageous, and the slightest bit foolhardy, like a Took, while also having been tempered with a serious-minded practicality. This is how he came to choose Bilbo to join the company, believing that by his mixed Took and Baggins ancestry, he would have the qualifications needed. The movie continues following the dwarves across many New Zealand landscapes as they make their way without Gandalf. Having fallen behind to stall the White Council and needing to catch up, gives an explanation as to why Gandalf disappears from this portion of the story. In the novel, Gandalf simply disappears in a flash of lightning magic once the goblins attack. The movie follows the dwarves into the thunderstorm, eventually revealed to be a thunder battle by stone giants, just like in the book. However, it's clear that the movie has greatly exaggerated the situation. In the novel, the stone giants are not described to be made of stone themselves, and they are just assumed to be oversized humans who are hurling and kicking rocks at each other. They are not so large as to allow the dwarves to slip by unnoticed, as they are fearful that the giants might grab one of them to kick like a football. In the film, however, not only are the giants made of stone, but they are absolutely colossal in size. The film includes a brief action scene where the company are caught for a ride on one of the giant's knees and need to jump to safety before the creature collapses. This doesn't happen in the book, but it makes for an incredible visual. The scene follows with Bilbo hanging off the ledge and Thorin nearly slipping while trying to rescue him. This doesn't happen in the book, but it shows the increasing divide and hostility between Thorin and Bilbo, and serves to further alienate Bilbo from the group and increase his dislike for the quest. The group takes shelter in a cave to escape the storm and giants, the movie having Dwalin find it, while in the book has Fili and Kili searching for it. The absent Gandalf's worries and warnings are given over to Thorin, Thorin even refusing to let them light a fire to dry their clothes, and instead tells everyone to get to sleep. In the book, the company stays up for some time, blowing smoke rings whose color change and dance near the ceiling thanks to Gandalf's magic, each talking about what they will do with their share of the treasure before they fall asleep. A big difference in the film is Balin telling Thorin that Gandalf instructed them to wait for him in the mountains, but Thorin says the plan has changed, and that they'll be moving on at first light. The film includes a scene of Azog and his hunting party catching the dwarves' scent and beginning pursuing them into the Misty Mountains. In the movie, Bilbo packs up his things and intends to sneak away, abandoning the group and heading back to Rivendell before being stopped by Bofur. Bofur tries to dissuade him, being the most friendly of the group to Bilbo in the films, and sympathizes with Bilbo's plight. Bilbo inadvertently offends Bofur by saying that the dwarves are used to not having a home, only for him to quickly apologize. Bofur forgives the offense and wishes Bilbo luck, giving him his blessing to leave, before noticing the elvish blade glowing blue, cluing them in that they are in danger. This scene doesn't happen in the novel. Instead, Bilbo is plagued by dreams of cracks in the walls opening up and the floor giving way beneath them. He wakes in enough time to realize that the crack in the back of the cave is opening, and before they know it, the ponies are being taken. The irony is, in the movie, the company is dropped when the floor of the cave gives way by the goblins opening trapdoors beneath them, similar to a scenario that Bilbo dreams of in the novel. The dwarves don't get to put up much of a struggle, as when the doors give way, they are immediately dropped into a sliding tunnel which deposits them in a cage. There they are set upon by goblins who surround them and begin herding them on. In the novel, Bilbo manages to wake the dwarves in time to see the last of their ponies being taken. The goblins come after them next. Gandalf disappears, the lightning flash killing several goblins dead. During the struggle, the dwarves find themselves on the other side of the goblins' secret door, where they are beaten, chained, and then whipped to run into the dark tunnels. In the movie, Bilbo manages to slip away during the consternation by sneaking under the goblins' line of sight and managing to go unnoticed, playing on the Hobbit's natural talent for being unimpressive and undetectable. This separates Bilbo from the group, allowing him to follow the goblins with his elvish sword at the ready. He gets attacked by one goblin and nearly manages to fight it off before the creature sends them both tumbling off the bridge and into the dark chasm below. In the book, Bilbo stays with them throughout their time in the Goblin City, being chained and whipped and forced to run with the rest of them. It isn't until the next chapter that Bilbo is separated from them, and it honestly happens by complete accident. The group is taken to Goblin Town and are presented to the Great Goblin. While not in the theatrical version, the extended edition does feature a rendition of Down, Down to Goblin Town, sung by the Great Goblin himself, similar to how it is in the novel. The movie portrays the Goblin King as menacing with a slight comedic tone to him. He interrogates the dwarves, demanding to know what they're doing there, one of the lesser goblins even commenting how they found them on the front porch, like in the book. The extended edition extends the scene with some amusing bits. The goblins believe the dwarves are in league with elves due to all the Rivendell dishware that Nori stole from Elrond's house. After demanding an explanation, Oin tries to stall out the Goblin King due to his partial deafness. Bofur then amusingly tries to confuse the Great Goblin with a nonsense story, only to the goblin's irritation. The goblin announces that they will torture the information out of them before Thorin reveals himself. The Goblin King mocks Thorin before revealing Azog is alive and has set a bounty on him. He has his minions send word to Azog, letting him know that they have the dwarves. The exchange is different in the novel, with Thorin and the dwarves making an earnest effort to explain that they did not mean to trespass, even though they know it will do them no good. Regardless, the goblins intend to enslave the dwarves and work them to death, if not outright kill them. The film cuts to Bilbo in a dark cavern where he comes across Gollum. What follows is the movie adapting the next chapter of the book, Riddles in the Dark, and has it happening concurrently with the events of the previous chapter. The changes include that Bilbo actually witnesses Gollum losing the ring as it flies out of his pocket while battling the injured goblin. The movie, of course, focuses on Bilbo finding the ring, highlighting its significance for the future. The film features Gollum dragging the goblin's body away to eat it, whereas in the book, it's only mentioned that he likes eating goblins when he can get them. Bilbo is more assertive in the movie, as his fear of Gollum initially causes him to be more aggressive towards him. The movie, of course, highlights the two halves of Gollum's personality, something that is only hinted at during the original Hobbit, but is expanded upon in The Lord of the Rings. The riddle game is much shorter than it is in the book, with each of them only asking a total of 3 riddles, as opposed to the 5 in the book. The scene ends with Gollum preparing to don the ring from his pocket, only to discover it missing. In the book, Gollum went back to his island in the center of the lake to retrieve it, only to gradually realize that it's gone, and come to the conclusion that Bilbo stole it. The scene ends with Gollum giving chase. The movie cuts back to the dwarves as the Goblin King sings about the various tortures he will inflict on them. One of the lesser goblins inspects Orcrist and hisses upon seeing the runes on the blade. This frightens the Great Goblin and angers him, immediately ordering him to kill all the dwarves, ordering that Thorin's head be cut off. This scene played out differently in the book. The goblins were cautious if the dwarves were up to any mischief in the mountains. When the dwarves refused, one of the goblins reveals Orcrist to the king. The Great Goblin recognizes it immediately, calling it the Goblin Cleaver, the Biter, and immediately orders that they all be killed, even rushing towards Thorin with the intent to bite his head off himself. A white flash of light causes all the torches to go out and knocks the goblins back. Gandalf arrives on the scene to rescue the dwarves. In the film, he inspires them to take up their weapons and fight, while the Great Goblin shies away from Gandalf's sword, the Beater. After dispatching the goblins and incapacitating the Goblin King, Gandalf leads the dwarves away towards a way out. In the novel, the scene plays out differently. The lights go out, and the bright light is instead caused by Glamdring glowing in the darkness. The Goblin King is struck down with a single blow. The group is led away into the tunnels, where they soon realize it is Gandalf who rescued them. The group follow along behind Gandalf, still enchained, most unable to use their hands. The dwarves run, taking turns carrying Bilbo on their shoulders, since he can't keep up. Gandalf uses Glamdring and cuts through the chains, releasing the dwarves and Bilbo from their bonds. The film cuts back to Bilbo trying to escape Gollum. Upon trying to slip through a crack in the rocks, Bilbo finds himself stuck by his brass buttons of his waistcoat, just as Gollum begins approaching him. Bilbo forces himself through, scattering the buttons. He falls to the ground, the ring flying up in the air, in a similar scene to the Fellowship of the Ring, before landing back on his finger, rendering him invisible. This is changed from the novel, as Bilbo inadvertently slipped the ring on after accidentally stubbing his toe on a rock. The scene of getting caught with his buttons happens near the end of the chapter, when he is sneaking out of the goblin's back door to the mountain. From this point on, Bilbo follows Gollum as he searches the tunnels going for the back door. The novel has Gollum explain all of this to himself, deducing that Bilbo knew the way out, and his only hope is to cut him off and catch him before either he escapes or the goblins get him. The movie showcases the dwarves and all their various weapons and fighting techniques facing off the goblins. This is a departure from the novel, as the movie explicitly states that all the dwarves are fighters. In the book, however, the dwarves are only described as carrying a few knives, and the only weapons found among the group were Orcrist and Sting. I'll share my thoughts on that in another video. As such, the movie shows each of the dwarves putting up a fight. Before they reach the end, the Great Goblin confronts them one last time, blocking their path. Gandalf jabs him in the eye with his staff, slices open his belly, and kills him by cutting across his throat. The goblin's weight causes the bridge to collapse, setting them sliding down the cavern until they slow and come to a stop at the bottom. The dwarves keep moving as the hordes come down on them, with Gandalf leading to the exit. This is changed from the novel, first and foremost being the Great Goblin had already been killed. Secondly, as mentioned, the only ones to do any fighting in this scene are Gandalf and Thorin, having fallen behind the group to fight off any goblins that came too near, leading them right into Beater and Biter. This gives the group enough of a head start to slip away. The goblins pursue, now being quick and quiet to sneak up on the group, much so that not even Gandalf heard them coming. It is here that Dory is grabbed by one of the goblins, which causes him to drop Bilbo. This is where Bilbo is separated from the group in the novel, leading to the events of the next chapter. The movie has already saved time by showing this scene running parallel to the escape from the goblins. The movie shows Bilbo witnessing Gandalf leading the company out of the back door, an unguarded crack in the mountain. Bilbo prepares to follow them, readying his sword to kill Gollum. Much like in the book, Bilbo has a brief moment of pity and decides to spare Gollum's life. Gollum realizes that Bilbo is there and tries to grab him, only for Bilbo to leap over him, just like in the book. But unlike in the book, Bilbo kicks Gollum in the face when he passes over. Bilbo escapes, and much like in the book, Gollum curses him, saying, "We hate you forever!" In the book, the way out is a gated door heavily guarded by the goblins. The goblins spot Bilbo in a brief moment when he is not wearing the ring. Fortunately, Bilbo disappears before they catch him. Bilbo has to dodge several goblins looking for him to get to the door. The door is ajar enough that he can squeeze through the gap, getting caught by the buttons as mentioned before. The sunlight from the outside exposes Bilbo's shadow, alerting the goblins to him. Bilbo escapes, and the goblins pursuing him outside, but only briefly as they can't tolerate the sun. For now, Bilbo is safely outside the mountain and realizes that he's come all the way out the other side of the Misty Mountains, but he soon realizes that he's lost all of his supplies, save for his sword, and is now separated from the dwarves and wizard. Bilbo doesn't know what to do, nor what could have happened to them. When he concludes the possibility that the dwarves are still trapped in the goblin tunnels, for a moment he resolves himself to go back inside and try to rescue them. Bilbo isn't given this opportunity in the movie, as he already knew the company was safe and was following them out of the mountain. However, the movie did provide him with a similar chance when he initially escaped the goblins and raided his sword to go after the group earlier in the film. Bilbo prepares to do his duty to his friends when he overhears the dwarves' voices up ahead. Bilbo conveniently stumbles upon the group of them, deciding whether or not to go back in there and look for Bilbo upon realizing that Dory lost him. In the novel, Gandalf insists they go back and help him, claiming Bilbo is his friend and feels responsible for him. The dwarves refuse to go, claiming that Bilbo has been more of a burden than he's worth. Bilbo reveals himself and tells them all about his adventure, save for the part about the ring. In the movie, when Nori mentions spotting Bilbo slipping under the goblin's notice, Thorin deduces that Bilbo sees the opportunity to get away and save himself, heading back to his home in the Shire. Bilbo, still invisible, ponders this for a moment and considers taking the opportunity to abandon the adventure and try to get back home. Thorin is certain they won't be seeing him again, only for Bilbo to reveal himself to them. They are all astonished by him having gotten past the goblins, but Bilbo does not reveal anything to them. Gandalf notices Bilbo slipping the ring into his pocket, but doesn't press the matter. When Thorin asks why he came back, Bilbo answers that, while he does miss his home, he understands how the dwarves feel. They miss their home as well, because it was taken from them, and Bilbo will help them reclaim it if he can. It's a powerful scene, the screenplay detailing that at this moment, with no mention of the treasure or reward, the dwarves realize that Bilbo actually cares about all of them. The novel features Gandalf explaining that they have spent at least 3 days in the Goblin Tunnel, from Monday night to Thursday afternoon. He also explains that using the back door has brought them off their path too far to the north, and still have to make their way down the remaining slopes of the Misty Mountain. The group complains of hunger, having lost their supplies and not eaten for days. They travel down the slope of the mountain, avoiding a rock slide by sheltering near some trees down at the bottom. After nightfall, they come to a clearing, only to hear a pack of wargs coming up on them. The group climbs into the trees for shelter, with Bilbo needing help to climb into the tree. The wargs were there to meet a troop of goblins to prepare a raid of the nearby town. When they spot the group, they believe them to be spies, intending to warn the village of their movements. Gandalf tries to drive the wolves away by throwing enchanted pine cones at them, which burst into magical flames. The wolves catch fire and can't seem to put the flames out, spreading flames to the other trees. The goblins shortly arrive and direct the fires back toward the tree the company shelters in, singing a song to mock them, 15 Funny Birds. During the commotion, the Lord of the Eagles comes upon the scene and leads his fellow eagles in an attack on the goblins, rescuing Gandalf and the others. The dwarves are picked up by the eagles' talons, with Bilbo having to cling to Dory's legs to not get left behind. The movie skips most of this and immediately cuts to Azog and the orc pack having finally caught up with the company. The wargs charge in, chasing the group to the edge of the cliff, where they split up, climbing into 3 separate trees. Azog reveals himself, shocking Thorin and announcing his desire to kill Thorin himself. He orders the wargs to kill the others. The wolves begin jumping up to the branches and begin taking the trees down, forcing the group to jump from one tree to the next. During this, Gandalf whispers to a butterfly to send word to the eagles for help. When the company is all in one tree, Gandalf begins lighting pine cones on fire to throw at the wolves to drive them off. The company join in and seem to repel the wargs back. The tree's roots begin to give, and the tree begins to fall off the edge of the cliff. Dory and Ori nearly fall, Gandalf saving them with his staff. Azog and Thorin stare each other down. Thorin descends from the tree, readying Orcris to fight Azog again. Azog quickly dispatches Thorin from atop his warg and defeats him. Beaten and unable to defend himself, Thorin is helpless as an orc prepares to decapitate him. Bilbo rushes in, shoving the orc aside before stabbing it in the chest. He defends Thorin as Azog and his warg riders close in. Fili, Kili, and Dwalin rush in to protect Bilbo and Thorin. At that moment, the butterfly returns to signal the eagle's arrival. Dory and Ori slip from Gandalf's staff, only to be saved by landing on an eagle's back. The birds begin to attack the orcs and wargs, driving them off. The eagles proceed to pick the dwarves up, in particular grabbing the unconscious Thorin. The rest of the company is picked up by the eagles and dropped onto their backs. The tree begins to give and go over the cliff, and Gandalf is saved by landing on the back of the Lord of the Eagles himself. The eagles carry the company off to safety while Azog howls at having lost them. The film heavily abridges the scene with the eagles, giving the birds no lines of dialogue, nor feature the scene of taking the group to the Great Shelf to shelter them in their eyries. Instead, the movie features the birds taking the company directly to the Carrock and dropping them off. Gandalf goes to treat Thorin without so much as a thank you to the birds. In the novel, the eagles rescue the group and take them to their nests, when the group is none too sure of their intentions. Gandalf reveals that he is friends with the Lord of Eagles for having mended an arrow wound he had taken. The bird felt inclined to repay his debt to Gandalf when he noticed that they were in trouble. Gandalf and the dwarves ask if the eagles can take them further on their journey. The eagles claim they will only go so far and nowhere near any settlements for fear of being shot at by archers. They do offer to give the group shelter for the night, and even hunt some hares and a sheep for them to have for dinner. This is in sharp contrast to how the eagles are depicted in the movies. A common misconception has risen due to Gandalf using a butterfly to send for them. It's led many to believe that Gandalf has the power to just summon the eagles at will, and they will heed his call and ferry him to wherever destination he chooses, almost like a taxi service. The movies do nothing to explain that the birds are intelligent beings with wills and motives of their own and can't just be called upon except for times of greatest need. And even then, it depends on their own temperament. The next morning, the eagles bring the dwarves, allowing them to ride on their backs this time, far off the Great Shelf and the rest of the way off the Misty Mountains, down to the Carrock. The eagles drop them off and give them customary polite farewells, with Gandalf returning the proper phrase and thanks. The novel describes the future for the eagles, but states that Bilbo never truly saw them again, save for during the Battle of Five Armies, a rare tease from the book of things to come. The book describes the Carrock of being a large, smooth rock the size of a hill with a flat top and steps leading up to it. In the movie, the Carrock is in the shape of a bear, a symbol that they have reached Beorn's land. The film has Gandalf revive Thorin and reveal he's going to be alright. Thorin recovers and immediately begins to question what Bilbo was doing. Though it seems that Thorin is frustrated with Bilbo, he admits he was wrong about him and hugs him, recognizing that Bilbo saved his life. It shows at this point on that Bilbo and Thorin are starting to become friends. The movie ends on a scene with the group spotting the Lonely Mountain in view, still a great distance away. They also spot a thrush flying toward it, taking it as an omen of good fortune, Bilbo believing that the worst is now behind them. The shot follows the thrush to the mountain where it seizes a small snail and begins tapping it on the rocks to break its shell. The scene cuts into the treasure hoard inside to give a brief glimpse of Smaug being woken up by the knocking sound, teasing us for his inevitable reveal in the next movie. And there you have it, all the differences between The Hobbit: An Unexpected Journey and the Hobbit novel. I combed through and listed off all the major differences I could. Feel free to let me know if I've left some out. Like I said, people, I feel An Unexpected Journey is the closest in adapting its portion of the source material as it could. When you get down to it, almost everything covered in the first 6 chapters of the story, with some of the 7th chapter, is present in the movie. The only difference is certain events are either rearranged, streamlined for a more cohesive narrative, or abridged for the sake of saving time. The only major additions the movie makes is the subplot involving the necromancer in Dol Guldur, and the inclusion of Radagast, Galadriel, and Saruman. I'll have to save words on that for when I do the Desolation of Smaug, but for right now what I can say is it is only logical to have included them. It's once again establishing that we're still a part of that world from Peter Jackson's first 3 movies, and these characters do exist at this time, but I'll save my thoughts on that for another video. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and could see that the movies were not so heavily altered from the book as previously thought. Next time, I'll be talking about my personal opinion on the first of the Hobbit trilogy, and how I feel it compares to the novel. For Part 2, The Desolation of Smaug, while I'm actually a bit torn, my intentions were that I would release these videos 1 year at a time, with my comparison of Desolation being released next December for the film's 10th anniversary. If you guys would like me to consider doing the episode earlier sometime next year, please let me know in the comments down below. Don't forget to like this video and share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more, and as always, I'll catch you guys in the next video. Later.